Hi friends. If you're enjoying my videos, please hit the like button. It helps the YouTube algorithm notice me. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. It's strange how memories can lie dormant for years, only to surface with crystal clarity when something triggers them. I'm writing this account now in 2024, but the events I'm about to describe took place in 2015 when I was 17. Sometimes I wonder if I should share this story at all. If by putting these words to paper, I might somehow summon back the thing that haunted us. But the weight of keeping this secret has become too heavy to bear alone. Our family's move to Michigan hadn't been planned. My father's company had undergone a sudden restructuring, and we found ourselves transplanted from suburban Connecticut to the rural Midwest with barely 2 months' notice. The house we ended up buying was at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, backing up against dense woods that stretched for miles. Across the street, a vast cow pasture rolled toward the horizon, creating an illusion of isolation despite the neighboring houses on either side. I remember the day we first viewed the property. It was early March, and patches of dirty snow still clung to the shadows beneath the trees. The real estate agent, a nervous woman who kept checking her phone, seemed eager to close the deal quickly. Now I wonder if she knew something. If there was a reason the previous owners had left so abruptly, leaving behind pieces of furniture and personal items as if they'd fled in a hurry. The house itself was nothing remarkable at first glance. A 2-story colonial built in the late 1990s, painted a subdued sage green with white trim. But there was something about it that caught your eye and held it, like a sentence that seems normal until you read it twice. The windows were slightly too large for the facade, creating an unsettling effect that you couldn't quite put your finger on. The front door was solid oak, carved with an intricate pattern that our father said was typical Victorian decoration, but which I later realized formed abstract shapes that seemed to shift when viewed too long. From the day we moved in, something felt wrong. Not in any way I could articulate at first, just a persistent unease that seemed to hover at the edges of my consciousness. The air inside the house was always too still, as if it were holding its breath. Sounds behaved strangely. Conversations in one room would carry perfectly to another, while shouts from right next door would be muffled beyond recognition. My younger sister Madeline, who was 14 at the time, felt it too. She would sometimes stop mid-sentence while we were unpacking, cocking her head as if listening to something just beyond the range of human hearing. Our parents dismissed our concerns, attributing them to the natural adjustment period of moving to a new home. Mother threw herself into redecorating, as if enough fresh paint and new curtains could mask the fundamental wrongness of the place. Father spent long hours in his new home office, the door firmly closed, on endless conference calls that seemed to echo oddly through the heating vents. I chose a bedroom on the second floor, overlooking the backyard and the woods beyond. The previous owners had painted it a pale blue that reminded me of winter skies, and something about the color seemed to repel the shadows that gathered so thickly in other parts of the house. I remember standing at my window that first evening, watching the sun set through the tree line. The shadows seemed to move differently here, stretching and contracting in ways that defied the normal physics of light. The trees themselves appeared to shift position when viewed from different windows, though I told myself this was just a trick of perspective. That first night, none of us slept well. The house made unfamiliar sounds, not the normal creaks and groans of a structure settling, but something more deliberate. It sounded almost like conversation, conducted in whispers just below the threshold of comprehension. When I mentioned this at breakfast the next morning, Mother laughed nervously and said all houses had their quirks. But I noticed she'd already begun pricing sound-dampening insulation, and Father had installed new locks on all the interior doors. The initial months in the house followed a pattern that would become familiar, periods of relative normalcy punctuated by increasingly bizarre occurrences. Looking back, I realize now that the entity, I've taken to calling it that, though the term feels inadequate, was testing us, learning our routines, our fears, our breaking points. It started slowly, almost playfully, like a predator toying with its prey. The first truly inexplicable event occurred 3 weeks after we moved in. I had developed a habit of arranging my textbooks on my desk in precise order each night, a small ritual that helped me maintain some sense of control in our new environment. One morning in late March, I woke to find them perfectly stacked in the corner furthest from my bed, their spines facing the wall. When I mentioned this to my mother, she suggested I must have moved them while studying late. But I knew I hadn't. More disturbing was the fact that the dust on my desk showed no trails or marks indicating how the books had been moved. Similar incidents began occurring throughout the house with increasing frequency. Mother's carefully arranged kitchen implements would be found in different drawers. Father's important documents would vanish from his locked office, only to reappear days later in the basement, unmarked but smelling faintly of damp earth. Madeline's dolls, which she'd stopped playing with years ago but kept displayed on a shelf, would be found in different poses each morning, their heads invariably turned to face the woods behind our house. The local wildlife's behavior became increasingly erratic. The neighbors' dogs, 3 well-trained German shepherds, would often gather at the edge of their yards, staring intently into the woods behind our house. Their behavior was unsettling not just for its consistency, but for their complete silence. These dogs, normally vocal at the slightest provocation, would stand rigid and silent for hours, their hackles raised, tracking something we couldn't see with their eyes. The cows in the pasture across the street exhibited even stranger behavior. They would sometimes bunch together in tight groups, facing outward in defensive circles against some unseen threat. The farmer, Mr. Henderson, seemed puzzled by their behavior, but attributed it to coyotes or wolves in the area. But I'd seen enough National Geographic documentaries to know that prey animals don't behave that way around normal predators. They were reacting to something else, something that triggered a more primitive fear. Cold spots became a regular feature of our daily lives. They would appear without warning, patches of air so frigid they would cause your breath to mist even on warm days. These weren't the normal drafts you'd expect in an older home. They moved. I once tracked one as it traveled slowly up the main staircase, the temperature dropping by at least 20 degrees in its wake. The cold spots seemed to have purpose, intelligence even. They would often appear in doorways or at the foot of beds, as if standing guard or keeping watch. Our father, ever the pragmatist, initially tried to find logical explanations for everything. He had always been the type to meet uncertainty with research and reason. I would often find him in his office late at night, surrounded by printouts about house settling, local wildlife patterns, and meteorological phenomena. He installed carbon monoxide detectors in every room, had the water tested for contamination, and even hired a structural engineer to examine the foundation. Each investigation came back negative, each rational explanation eliminated, until even he had to admit that something wasn't right. The basement became a particular source of dread. It was unfinished, with rough stone walls that predated the house itself, apparently part of an older foundation that the developers had built upon. The previous owners had used it for storage, leaving behind shelves of preserved foods in mason jars that we never quite got around to clearing out. The preserves looked normal enough, but none of us could shake the feeling that the contents would be something entirely different if we actually opened them. Mother tried to brighten the space by installing additional lighting, but the bulbs burned out with suspicious regularity. Eventually, we gave up trying to keep it fully lit and settled for a single bare bulb that cast long, twisted shadows across the stone walls. It was during one of my rare trips to the basement to retrieve holiday decorations that I noticed the markings. They were subtle at first glance, just irregularities in the stone that could have been natural wear. But as I traced them with my flashlight, a pattern emerged. Symbols had been carved into the foundation stones, worn by time but still discernible. They didn't match any alphabet or writing system I could find in my research, but they had a deliberate quality that suggested meaning. More disturbing was their location. They appeared only on stones that faced the woods, as if forming a boundary or barrier. Winter approached slowly that year. but with an inevitability that felt almost purposeful. The trees behind our house held onto their leaves longer than those in the surrounding forest, creating an unnaturally dense canopy that seemed to absorb both light and sound. When the leaves finally did fall, they did so all at once, on a perfectly still night in late November. The sound woke us all, a sustained rustle that lasted for hours, like countless whispered conversations occurring just beyond our walls. That's when we started noticing the scratching sounds in the walls. At first, we attributed them to mice or squirrels seeking shelter from the cold. Father set traps throughout the house, but they remained untouched. The sounds continued, moving through the walls in patterns that seemed to follow us from room to room. They were loudest at night, of course. Sometimes they would stop abruptly if you pressed your ear to the wall, only to resume from a different location, as if whatever made them knew it was being listened for. The voices began so gradually that I sometimes wonder if they had been there all along, merely waiting for us to become attuned enough to hear them. They started as whispers, barely audible above the winter wind that howled through the bare branches of the woods. At first, we rationalized them as natural sounds, branches scraping against siding, wind finding its way through gaps in the weather stripping, or the house's normal settling sounds. But there was an intentionality to them that became impossible to ignore. They would respond to our conversations, mimicking the cadence of our speech patterns but twisted somehow, like hearing a familiar song played in a minor key. The voices seemed to take particular interest in Madeline and me, perhaps sensing our youth and vulnerability. They would call our names in the dark, using tones and inflections that perfectly matched our parents' voices, but always with something subtly wrong. A slight elongation of vowels, an emphasis on the wrong syllables. I remember one particular night in mid-December with painful clarity. I was up late studying for finals, my desk positioned near the window that overlooked the backyard. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and ice crystals had formed intricate patterns on the glass, patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when viewed directly. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like someone calling my name from the woods. The voice was eerily familiar. It was my mother's voice, but with an undertone that made my skin crawl. "Come look," it called, using the exact phrase and intonation my mother had used countless times during my childhood when she wanted to show me something interesting. But my actual mother was asleep in her room across the hall. I could hear her soft snoring through the wall. Despite every instinct screaming at me to look away, I found myself drawn to the window. The moon was full that night, casting stark shadows across the snow-covered yard. What I saw there made my blood run cold. At the edge of the woods, something moved in a way that nothing natural should move. It was like watching a shadow detach itself from the darkness, flowing between the trees with liquid grace. The movement was both fascinating and deeply wrong, like watching a time-lapse video of decay in reverse. The worst part wasn't the movement itself, but the awareness behind it. The thing was performing for me, putting on a show that it knew I couldn't look away from. It would pause occasionally, seeming to gauge my reaction, before continuing its impossible dance between the trees. I noticed with growing horror that it never completely emerged from the shadows. Instead, it seemed to wear them like a cloak, bending the darkness around itself in ways that defied physics. When I finally managed to tear myself away from the window and draw the curtains, the voice changed. It was no longer using my mother's tones, but instead spoke in a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The words were unclear, but the meaning felt malevolent, almost mocking. I spent the rest of the night with my back pressed against the wall, listening as that thing circled our house until dawn, its movement marked by the crunch of snow and the occasional scrape of something sharp against the siding. The next morning, I examined the house's exterior. Deep gouges marked the walls at irregular intervals, forming patterns that reminded me of the symbols in the basement. But these were fresh, still dusted with powdered paint and wood. When I showed them to my father, he blamed raccoons, but his voice shook slightly as he said it, and he spent the rest of the day installing motion-activated lights around the property. The lights proved worse than the darkness. They would trigger at random intervals throughout the night, illuminating empty spaces where something had been just seconds before. Sometimes they would catch glimpses of movement at the edge of their range, quick flickers of something that wasn't quite there, like trying to see a shadow in your peripheral vision. After a week, we disconnected them. The darkness at least left room for doubt. The lights only confirmed our worst fears. The incident that still haunts me most happened to my sister Madeline in the depths of that endless winter. January had wrapped our world in silence, the heavy snow muffling all sound except for the persistent whispers from the woods. The cold had become a living thing, seeping through the walls despite our furnace running constantly, creating patches of frost on interior walls that formed patterns too regular to be natural. Madeline had always been more sensitive to the house's peculiarities than the rest of us. She had an artist's eye for detail and kept a sketchbook filled with drawings of things she glimpsed through windows or in mirrors, shapes that would vanish when anyone else tried to look. Those sketches grew increasingly disturbing as winter progressed, showing twisted forms that seemed to shift and change even on the static paper. The night it happened was marked by an unusual clarity. The moon was full, hanging low and bloated in the sky, casting stark shadows across the snow-covered landscape. The temperature had dropped well below zero, creating an absolute stillness broken only by the occasional sharp crack of trees splitting in the cold. Madeline later told me she had woken suddenly, though she couldn't say what had roused her. The wrong feeling, as she called it, pressed against her chest like a physical weight. Her room, normally cluttered with the typical chaos of a teenager, had been meticulously arranged while she slept, every object aligned at precise right angles, all facing toward her window. The neighbor's security light cast a harsh glow through her curtains, but the shadow it projected was impossible. It took the form of a deer's head, complete with a massive rack of antlers, yet everything about its proportions was fundamentally wrong. The angles were too sharp, the dimensions too elongated to belong to any natural creature. Most disturbing was its solidity. Despite the wind that had picked up outside, the shadow remained perfectly still, as if it were painted on the curtain. Madeline lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the shadow maintained its vigil. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, a trick of light and wind, but then it moved. Not the natural movement of a shadow following its source, but a deliberate turning of the head to face her directly. The antlers shifted and multiplied in ways that defied physical law, creating patterns that hurt her eyes to look at. The shadow remained for exactly 3 hours. We know this because every clock in the house stopped at that moment, starting again only when the thing finally vanished. It didn't fade or gradually disappear. It simply ceased to exist between one blink and the next, leaving behind a perfect silence and a cold so intense it had frosted over the inside of Madeline's window. When she finally found the courage to move, Madeline discovered that her sketchbook had been opened to a blank page. Across it, in handwriting that was almost but not quite her own, was written a single phrase in what we later identified as Old English. "We see you seeing us." The next morning, we investigated the area outside her window. The snow below was pristine, unmarked by any tracks or disturbances. The neighbor's security light had burned out, its bulb not merely dead but crystallized from within, forming patterns similar to those we'd found in the basement. When we measured the angle of where any shadow should have fallen, we found it mathematically impossible for anything to have cast a shadow on Madeline's window from that position. More disturbing were the changes in Madeline herself. The incident left her with a heightened awareness of things the rest of us could barely perceive. She began to notice patterns in seemingly random events, the way birds would fall silent in sequence as something unseen moved through the woods, the subtle shifts in air pressure that preceded each supernatural occurrence. She started sleeping with her lights on, though she admitted this only made the shadows deeper and more purposeful. Spring arrived that year like a held breath finally released, but it brought no relief from the strangeness that had taken root in our lives. The melting snow revealed patterns in our yard, dead patches of grass forming complex geometric shapes that seemed to shift position when viewed from different windows. As the days grew longer, we realized that longer light didn't mean safety. It just meant we could see more of what had previously been hidden by darkness. The first scream came on an unusually mild April evening. Our father, maintaining his habit of trying to pretend everything was normal, had left the front door open to let in the spring breeze. We were all in the living room, half watching a documentary about deep-sea creatures, when the sound shattered the quiet night. It came from the direction of the cow pasture, a sound that began almost human before twisting into something that shouldn't exist in our reality. The initial scream had a quality that defied description. It contained elements of a wolf's howl, a woman's cry, and something else, something older than human speech. It set off an immediate chain reaction. Every dog in the neighborhood began barking frantically, their usual territorial warnings transformed into sounds of pure terror. The cattle in the pasture, previously settling down for the night, erupted into panic, forming tight circles with their young in the center. But worse than the first scream were those that followed. Each new cry seemed closer than the last, moving in a deliberate pattern that we later mapped out. A spiral closing in on our house. The sounds contained layers of complexity that shouldn't have been possible from a single source. Sometimes they seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if whatever made them could be in several places simultaneously. The temperature dropped dramatically as the screams approached, frost forming on our windows despite the mild spring air. We huddled together in the living room, all pretense of skepticism abandoned. Even our father, who had maintained his rationalist stance through everything else, looked shaken. His hands trembled as he tried to call the police, only to find that every phone in the house, cell phones included, displayed the same message: no signal available. The screams continued for exactly 17 minutes. We knew because every clock in the house had stopped again, just as they had during Madeline's encounter. When they finally ceased, the silence that followed was somehow worse. It felt thick, expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, jumping at every creak and settling sound the house made. When dawn finally came, we found evidence that the previous night hadn't been a shared hallucination. Deep tracks marked the earth of our front yard, tracks that started abruptly in the middle of the lawn and disappeared just as suddenly. They resembled deer prints but were wrong somehow. Too deep, too regularly spaced, and occasionally showing signs of impossible angles, as if whatever made them could bend its legs in ways that would shatter any earthly creature's bones. More disturbing were the patterns we found drawn in the dew on our windows. Complex symbols, similar to those in the basement but more elaborate, covered every pane of glass facing the woods. They faded as the sun rose higher, but Madeline managed to sketch several of them in her notebook before they disappeared completely. Months later, we would discover similar symbols in centuries-old church records, described as warnings against those who walk between shadows. After the night of the screams, I began researching obsessively, driven by a need to understand what we were dealing with. The local library became my sanctuary, though even there I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The building itself was old, one of the original structures in town, and its basement archives held records dating back to the first European settlements in the area. My initial searches focused on the history of our property. The house was relatively new, built in the 1990s, but the land it stood on had a darker history. Before the subdivision was built, it had been part of a larger farm property. The family who owned it, the Whitakers, had disappeared without explanation in 1947. Their farmhouse, which had stood approximately where our house now was, had burned to the ground shortly after. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but newspaper accounts from the time mentioned strange symbols found carved into the foundation stones. Stones that I now realized had been incorporated into our basement walls. Going further back, I discovered that the Whitakers weren't the first to vanish from that land. In 1888, a hunting lodge had stood near the edge of the woods. Its owner, a wealthy industrialist named Montgomery Pierce, had written extensively in his journals about movements in the trees and voices that speak in tongues unknown to man. His final entry, dated November 13th, 1888, contained a crude drawing of what appeared to be a deer-like figure standing upright, with proportions that matched what we had seen. Pierce and his entire household vanished during a winter storm that same year. The Native American history of the area proved even more enlightening, though much of it had been deliberately obscured or destroyed by early settlers. I found translations of oral histories that spoke of a place where the shadows walk upright and the voices of the hungry ones echo. These accounts consistently warned against building permanent structures in that area, describing it as a thin place where the boundary between worlds had worn away. Two possibilities kept surfacing in my research: the Skinwalker of Navajo legend and the Wendigo of Algonquian-speaking peoples' mythology. The Skinwalker, a malevolent witch who could transform into any animal, seemed to fit some aspects of our experiences. The mimicry of voices, the impossible movements, the sense of intelligent malice behind the encounters, all were consistent with Skinwalker lore. But the Wendigo resonated more deeply with what we'd seen and heard. The deer-like appearance, the screams, the way it seemed to become more active during the coldest months. These aligned perfectly with traditional Wendigo descriptions. The fact that we were in Michigan, historically Algonquian territory, lent additional weight to this theory. I found an academic paper from 1972 that documented similar incidents across the region. Dr. Eleanor Blackstone, a folklore professor from the University of Michigan, had collected accounts spanning over a century. Her research was never published officially. The paper I found was a draft copy tucked away in the archive's restricted section. Dr. Blackstone herself had disappeared while conducting field research in the area, leaving behind only her notes and a series of increasingly disturbing audio recordings. The recordings, preserved on magnetic tape and transferred to digital format by a previous archivist, contained interviews with local residents about their experiences. One account in particular stood out: an elderly woman describing events from her childhood in 1923 that perfectly matched what Madeline had experienced at her window. The woman's description of the shadow's movements, the impossible angles of its antlers, even the way it seemed to be performing for its audience, all of it aligned with our experiences in ways that couldn't be coincidental. More disturbing were the patterns that emerged from these collected accounts. The incidents seemed to follow a cycle, becoming more intense every 30 years. If my calculations were correct, we had moved into the house just as one of these cycles was reaching its peak. The previous documented cycle in the mid-1980s had culminated in the disappearance of 3 families from the area within a single month. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that we were dealing with something ancient and malevolent, something that had claimed the woods behind our house as its territory long before human settlement. The entity seemed to follow rules, patterns that could be discerned if you knew where to look. It was bound to the woods, but could influence the surrounding area. It seemed to gain strength from fear and attention, yet paradoxically sought out witnesses to its manifestations. My research took an unexpected turn when I discovered a small collection of letters in the archive's restricted section. They were written in 1876 by a Catholic priest, Father Michael O'Malley, who had been sent to investigate reports of strange occurrences in the area. His early letters were skeptical, attributing the incidents to mass hysteria or natural phenomena. But his later correspondence became increasingly desperate, describing encounters that matched our own experiences with frightening accuracy. Father O'Malley's final letter, dated December 21st, 1876, contained a detailed drawing of symbols identical to those we'd found in our basement. His accompanying notes suggested they were meant to be protective wards, but warned that they were double-edged swords that could also serve as anchors, binding the entity more firmly to our reality. The priest disappeared shortly after writing this letter, though local records showed no official investigation into his fate. The last incident occurred exactly 1 year after the first screams. Despite our newfound knowledge and precautions, a simple oversight, the front door left open on a mild evening, invited the final confrontation. The screams started just as they had before, but now they carried purpose. The sounds formed patterns we recognized from the ancient texts I'd studied, words in a language too old for human tongues. The entity moved with deliberate intent, starting from the woods, crossing the cow pasture, and approaching our house with methodical precision. Standing in the living room, I watched through the open door as it finally revealed itself fully. The creature emerged from the darkness like smoke given form, its body a twisted amalgamation of human and deer features. It stood impossibly tall, its antlers scraping against our second-story windows. The moonlight seemed to bend around it, creating shadows that moved independently of their source. In that moment, we understood what the ancient texts meant about those who walk between. The entity existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, parts of it disappearing and reappearing as it moved, its form defying physical laws. Our father slammed the door shut, but we spent that night listening to it circle the house, its claws leaving deep grooves in the siding. The markings it left weren't random. They matched the symbols from the basement, but reversed, as if it were unraveling the ancient protections. We moved out within the month. The official reason was my father's job transfer, but we all knew the truth. Some places aren't meant for human habitation. Some territories remain the domain of older, darker things that predate our civilization. Years have passed, but the experience has marked us all. Madeline became an artist, her work filled with hidden symbols and shadowy forms that gallery critics praise for their otherworldly quality. Our parents rarely speak of that year, though mother still won't sleep in rooms with uncovered windows. The house still stands, occupied by new families who come and go with suspicious regularity. I've driven past it occasionally, always during daylight hours. The woods behind it seem darker somehow, more dense than the surrounding forest. Sometimes, if I look carefully, I can see something moving between the trees, something that doesn't quite match the movement of the branches in the wind. This is the first time I've written about these events. Part of me fears that putting these words to paper might attract its attention again. The old texts warn that these entities can be summoned simply by thinking about them too intently. But the weight of keeping this secret has become too heavy, and perhaps sharing this account will help others recognize the signs before it's too late. I still dream about it sometimes. The shadow at the window, the impossible screams, the thing that emerged from the darkness on that final night. In these dreams, it's always watching, waiting, calling me back to those woods. And sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, I catch myself wanting to answer, The late autumn wind whipped across the rolling hills of Kentucky horse country, carrying with it the first bitter bite of winter. I'd been working at Willow Creek Farm for just over 3 months, and already the shorter days were casting longer shadows across the weathered wooden barns and frost-covered paddocks. The property sprawled across 800 acres of prime bluegrass country, its history as deep as the limestone beneath our feet. I learned early on about the graves. They dotted the property like quiet sentinels, some marked with worn headstones dating back to the 1800s, others known only through carefully preserved property records and oral histories passed down through generations of farmhands. The owners maintained these sites with a reverence that spoke of old Kentucky values, trimming the grass by hand, keeping the horses away with discreet fencing, and welcoming the occasional visitor who came to lay flowers for their long-departed kin. My supervisor, Mrs. Helena Burton, had given me the standard orientation speech about the graves during my first week. "We respect our history here," she'd said, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, weathered hands clasped before her. These families were here long before us, and their descendants still consider this sacred ground. I'd nodded, thinking little of it at the time. Growing up in Kentucky, you get used to history being ever present. to old homesteads and family plots being part of the landscape. I was assigned to the North Barn, an imposing structure of hand-hewn beams and mortared stone that had stood for over a century. My barn partner, Rebecca Walsh, was a veteran of 15 years at Willow Creek, her knowledge of horses matched only by her efficiency. She had a habit of leaving me alone to tend to the barn while she checked the horses in the outlying fields, a responsibility I initially welcomed as a sign of trust. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I settled into the rhythm of barn life, the pre-dawn arrivals, the familiar sense of hay and leather, the comfortable routine of feeding and cleaning. But as November deepened and the days grew shorter, I began to notice things. Small things at first, easily dismissed. The sound of footsteps when I knew I was alone. The sensation of being watched while mucking stalls. The occasional whinny from what I knew to be an empty stall. It was during a particularly cold morning in early December when I had my first undeniable experience. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the frost-covered paddocks in shades of pale gold. Rebecca had left to do her morning field check, leaving me alone in the barn with our single-occupied stall, a young thoroughbred recovering from a minor injury. I was at the far end of the barn, focused on cleaning the last empty stall, when I heard them. Two distinct male voices engaged in conversation. The acoustics of the old barn made it impossible to make out their words, but the cadence was clear. One voice deep and authoritative, the other lighter and deferential. My first thought was that it must be Mr. Burton and one of the veterinarians making an early morning visit. Brushing off my gloves, I stepped out into the barn aisle, ready to greet them. The voices continued, seeming to come from the entrance about 60 feet away. But when I rounded the corner, I found only empty space and silence. The gravel drive outside showed no tire tracks, no footprints in the frost. The morning was still except for the soft nickering of our lone horse. I stood there for several long moments, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. The wind playing tricks, perhaps, or sounds carrying from one of the other barns. But I knew, with a certainty that settled cold in my stomach, that these explanations weren't sufficient. The voices had been too clear, too present. That incident marked the beginning of what would become a regular occurrence of inexplicable events. A few days later, while taking my lunch break in the small room we used as an office, I heard it. The distinctive sound of someone walking down the barn aisle with a lead rope. Click, click, click. The rhythm was unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time around horses, the sound of a brass clip swaying against itself with each step. I rose from my chair, sandwich forgotten, and peered out the office window that overlooked the barn aisle. Nothing. No movement, no shadow. Just the empty corridor stretching away in both directions. Yet the sound continued for several more steps before fading away. The incidents began to multiply. The rattle of feed buckets being hung on stall doors. 3 sharp metallic clasps clicking into place, a sound I'd heard hundreds of times during feeding. But when I went to check, the buckets hung undisturbed exactly where I'd left them. Sometimes it was the soft thud of rubber boots on wooden floors. Other times the scrape of a pitchfork against concrete. All the normal sounds of barn work, but occurring when no one was there to make them. As winter deepened, so did my discomfort. The early darkness meant spending more time in the barn under artificial light, the old fluorescent fixtures creating pools of harsh illumination separated by deeper shadows. I began to develop habits, keeping my back to walls whenever possible, glancing over my shoulder more frequently, rushing through tasks in the more isolated areas of the barn. Rebecca noticed my growing tension but seemed unsurprised. One evening, as we were finishing up our final checks, I finally confided in her about what I'd been experiencing. We sat in the office, steam rising from our coffee cups as I recounted each incident. "Everyone who's worked here long enough has stories," she said, her expression thoughtful. "This barn's been here since 1891. Think about how many people have worked here, lived here, died here." She paused, considering her next words. Last spring, I was doing night check during foaling season. There was no one else around, and I heard what sounded like a horse moving around in stall 12. You know, the big one at the end. The sound of hooves on brick, rustling in straw, even breathing and snorting. But that stall was empty. Had been for weeks. Hasn't had straw in it for years. Just bare brick floor. The incident that truly shook me occurred in mid-December. Rebecca and I were finishing up evening feeds. The winter night already pitch black outside our islands of fluorescent light. We were discussing the next day's schedule when we both heard it. A woman's laugh, clear as day, coming from around the corner near the tack room. It wasn't a malicious sound. Rather, it was light and musical, the kind of laugh you might hear during a pleasant conversation. But its very normalcy made it all the more chilling in the empty barn. Rebecca and I exchanged glances, and without a word, we both moved to investigate. The tack room and surrounding area were empty, of course. We checked every stall, every corner, even stepped outside to scan the surroundings with our flashlights. The farm was silent except for the winter wind and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. "That's a new one," Rebecca said quietly as we returned to our tasks. "Usually it's just the men's voices or the work sounds." Her casual acceptance of the supernatural occurrence somehow made it more real, more unsettling. My curiosity, fueled by equal parts fear and fascination, led me to dig into the farm's history. The local historical society maintained extensive records, and the farm's current owners had preserved many documents from previous generations. What I found painted a picture of life and death on a working horse farm spanning more than a century. The North Barn had been built by the Hamilton family, who owned this portion of what would become Willow Creek Farm. Census records showed a constant stream of workers living on the property: grooms, trainers, stable hands. Death certificates revealed accidents, illnesses, lives lived and ended among these very stalls where I now worked. One account particularly caught my attention, a notation from 1923 about a young woman named Margaret who had worked as a trainer's assistant. She was described as having a memorable laugh and being especially good with difficult horses. She died of influenza that winter, and according to the records, was buried in one of the small family plots on the property. As winter progressed, the activity in the barn seemed to increase. The sounds became more frequent, and new manifestations began to appear. The most significant was the shadow figure I glimpsed one evening while closing up. I was walking down the center aisle, checking that all the stall doors were secured, when movement caught my eye. At the far end of the barn, silhouetted against the security light that illuminated the entrance, a dark figure moved across the doorway. It was distinctly human in shape, but seemed to lack any detail, just a black silhouette that passed from one side of the door to the other in a smooth, silent motion. My first instinct was to call out, thinking it might be another worker. But something stopped me. Perhaps the absolute silence of the movement, or the way the figure seemed too dark, too solid against the background light. I stood frozen, watching, as the shadow passed back across the doorway in the opposite direction, then simply ceased to be. That was the moment I truly understood why people speak of their blood running cold. I felt a physical chill spread through my body, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone's flashlight. The barn entrance, when I finally gathered the courage to investigate, was empty and undisturbed. As I write this now, several months have passed since my first encounters with the unexplained at Willow Creek Farm. The incidents continue, though they've taken on a different character in my mind. What once inspired fear now prompts a complex mixture of emotions: respect, curiosity, and a deep awareness of the layers of history that surround us. I've learned to coexist with the echoes of the past that linger in the North Barn. The voices, the footsteps, the phantom sounds of daily work. They've become part of the barn's character, as much a part of its identity as the weathered beams and worn floorboards. Even the shadow figure, while still unsettling, seems less malevolent than it did at first. Perhaps just another echo of someone going about their duties, caught in an endless loop of time. Rebecca tells me this acceptance is common among long-term workers at Willow Creek. The way I see it, she said recently, they're just doing what we're doing. Taking care of the horses, keeping the barn running. They're just doing it from their side of time. The graves scattered across the property have taken on new significance for me. I find myself paying more attention to them during my daily rounds, noting the names and dates, wondering about the lives they represent. Sometimes when I hear those phantom footsteps or distant voices, I imagine I'm sharing the space with those who came before, all of us connected by our devotion to these magnificent animals in this historic place. The experience has taught me something about the nature of fear in history. What terrifies us at first, the unknown, the inexplicable, can become almost comfortable when we accept it as part of a larger story. The North Barn's ghosts, if that's what they are, seem less like supernatural invaders and more like co-workers from a different era, their routines and responsibilities echoing through time alongside our own. As winter gives way to spring, I find myself wondering what new experiences await in the North Barn. The activity seems to ebb and flow with the seasons, but it never entirely ceases. Like the graves that dot the property, like the ancient limestone beneath our feet, like the very walls of the barn itself, these manifestations have become part of the landscape of my daily life. A reminder that in places with deep history, the past is never truly past, but continues to resonate in ways both subtle and profound. Summer in Tennessee hits different when you're 13. The air hangs thick and heavy, like a wet blanket draped across your shoulders, and the cicadas scream their endless chorus into the suffocating heat. It was June 2010 when my mother drove me to Camp Bucktum's, her hands gripping the steering wheel with that determined set to her jaw I'd come to recognize. She'd been pushing the Boy Scouts thing since Dad left, convinced it would build character. I didn't have the heart to tell her I'd rather spend my summer anywhere else. Camp Bucktum's sprawled across several hundred acres of dense Tennessee wilderness, about 2 hours east of Nashville. The main entrance was marked by a weathered wooden sign, its carved letters spelling out the camp's name beneath the Boy Scouts emblem. As we pulled into the gravel parking lot, I watched other kids spilling out of their parents' cars, their green uniforms crisp and new-looking compared to my handed-down one. "You'll do great, Ryan," Mom said, squeezing my shoulder. "Troop 417 has been coming here for years. Mr. Walsh says it's the best scout camp in the state." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The truth was, everything about this place set my teeth on edge. Maybe it was the way the dense forest pressed in around the clearing, or how the shadows seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. Even from the parking lot, I could tell the buildings were spread far apart, connected by winding trails that disappeared into the undergrowth. Our troop gathered near the registration cabin where Mr. Walsh, our scoutmaster, was checking us in. There were 15 of us total, mostly kids I knew from school, though none I'd call close friends. The air smelled of pine needles and decay, that peculiar mustiness that rises from the forest floor in summer. "Listen up, boys," Mr. Walsh called out, his clipboard tucked under one arm. "We're in Campsite Delta, about a quarter mile from here. Bathroom facilities are shared with 3 other sites located at the trail junction. Showers are another 5 minutes past that. Remember the buddy system. Nobody goes anywhere alone, especially after dark." As we hiked to our campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods were alive with normal summer sounds, birds calling, leaves rustling, distant shouts from other campers, but underneath it all was a tension I couldn't explain. Like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The initial day passed in a blur of setup and orientation. We pitched our tents in a clearing ringed by towering oaks, their branches creating a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns on the ground. The air was thick with humidity, and by evening, my uniform was stuck to my back with sweat. It was during the walk to the mess hall for dinner that I first noticed it, the sensation of being watched. We were moving in a group, following the marked trail, when the feeling hit me like a physical weight between my shoulder blades. I stopped, turning to look behind me. but there was nothing there except shadows and trees. "Keep up, Ryan," Mr. Walsh called from the front of the group. "Don't want to miss hot dog night." I hurried to catch up, but the feeling persisted. It wasn't like being watched by a person. This felt older, colder, something that didn't think quite like we did. I tried to rationalize it as normal woods-induced paranoia, the kind of thing that happens to city kids when they're suddenly surrounded by wilderness. But deep down, I knew it was something else. The mess hall was a long, low building with screened windows and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick. I sat with my troop, picking at my hot dog while conversations flowed around me. From our table, I could see into the woods through the screens, where the darkness was gathering between the trees like spilled ink. "Did you guys notice anything weird on the trail?" I asked Kevin, the kid sitting next to me. He looked up from his food, confused. "Weird how?" "Like," I struggled to put it into words. "Like something watching us?" "It's the woods, man," he laughed. "Probably just deer or something. My dad says this place is full of them." But it wasn't deer. I knew what deer felt like. I'd been hunting with my uncle enough times. This was different. This felt intelligent. The second day brought archery practice and knot tying lessons, normal scout activities that should have been boring but safe. Instead, the feeling of wrongness intensified. During archery, I kept seeing movement at the edge of the range, quick, darting shapes that vanished when I tried to focus on them. The instructor must have noticed my distraction because he pulled me aside after I missed my 5th shot in a row. "Everything okay, son?" he asked, his weathered face creased with concern. "You seem a bit jumpy today." I wanted to tell him about the shadows, about the way the woods went quiet when you walked alone, about the feeling of being hunted. Instead, I just shrugged. "Just tired, sir. Didn't sleep well." That wasn't a lie. None of us had slept well. The night had been filled with strange sounds, rustling around the tents, soft scratching noises, and once what sounded like breathing right outside the thin nylon wall by my head. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out with my flashlight, there was nothing there except deep claw marks in the dirt. During the afternoon nature hike, I hung toward the middle of the group, trying to ignore the way the trees seemed to lean in over the trail, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers. The guide was pointing out different types of local flora, but I couldn't focus on his words. The feeling of being watched had become constant now, an itch between my shoulder blades that wouldn't go away. The third day was when everything went wrong. The day itself had been hot and sticky, the kind of weather that makes you feel dirty no matter what you do. After dinner, Mr. Walsh announced the usual shower schedule. Most of the troop headed out together, but I hung back, my stomach churning at the thought of the communal showers. "I'll wait," I told him, hoping he'd understand. His face softened slightly. "That's fine, Ryan, but I can't spare anyone to wait with you. You'll have to go alone." "But what about the buddy system?" I protested, remembering his own warnings from the first day. "Sometimes we have to make exceptions," he said, already turning away. "Just don't take too long. Be back before full dark." I waited in the empty campsite, watching the sun sink lower through the trees. When the rest of the troop returned, chattering and clean, it was already twilight. The shadows were long and deep, and the woods had taken on that peculiar quality they get at dusk, where familiar shapes become strange and threatening. Gathering my shower supplies and towel, I set out on the trail. The distance to the shower building seemed longer now that I was alone, each step taking me deeper into the gathering darkness. I talked to myself as I walked, trying to fill the silence with something human. "This is stupid," I muttered. "Nothing to be afraid of, just woods, just regular old Tennessee woods." But they weren't regular woods anymore. The normal evening sounds, the chirping of crickets, The calls of night birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, had gone completely silent. The silence was absolute, pressing against my ears like cotton wool, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. I was about halfway to the showers when I heard it. A low, wet sound, like someone trying to breathe through a mouthful of fluid. It came from somewhere off to my left, in the deeper shadows between the trees. My feet stopped moving of their own accord, every muscle in my body going rigid with primal fear. The sound came again, closer now, accompanied by the snap of a branch and the rustle of leaves. Something was moving through the undergrowth, something that didn't care about being quiet anymore. The rational part of my brain tried to categorize it. Not a deer, too deliberate. Not a bear, too quiet. Not a person. The movement was wrong. All wrong. I ran. The shower building loomed ahead, its concrete walls pale in the dying light. I hit the door at full speed, yanking it open and diving inside. The fluorescent lights flickered and hummed, casting harsh shadows in the tiled space. My eyes darted around, looking for somewhere to hide. The shower stalls themselves were just open cubicles. No good. But there in the corner was a supply closet for towels and cleaning supplies. I squeezed inside, pulling the door shut as quietly as possible. The space was tight, barely big enough for me to stand, and it smelled of bleach and mildew. Through a crack where the door hadn't quite closed properly, I could see a slice of the main room. For 2 minutes, there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then the outer door creaked open. What entered the shower building wasn't human. Its movements were too fluid, too wrong, like watching a spider move in stop motion. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and impossibly thin, its pale skin stretched tight over jutting bones. Where its face should have been, there was a nightmare. No lips, revealing blackened gums and teeth that looked like they had been stained with rust. Its eyes. God. Its eyes were like looking into empty wells, bottomless and hungry. The creature moved through the shower room in a series of jerky, unsettling motions, its head twitching from side to side like a bird's. Its hands, if you could call them hands, ended in long, curved claws that clicked against the tile floor as it walked. The sound echoed in the empty building, a steady tap, tap, tap that made my skin crawl. I pressed myself further back into the closet, trying to make myself as small as possible. My lungs were burning. I realized I'd been holding my breath. The thing paused, its head snapping toward the closet door, and I felt my heart stop. It knew. It had to know. Those empty eyes seemed to stare directly at my hiding place, and I could smell it now. A sickly sweet odor of decay and something else, something chemical and wrong. The creature took a step toward the closet, then another. I could hear it breathing now. A wet, raspy sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside its chest. My vision started to blur with tears I refused to let fall, knowing that any sound might give me away. Then, unexpectedly, voices echoed from outside, another group of scouts heading to the showers. The creature's head whipped toward the sound, and with a movement too quick to follow, it was gone. The outer door hadn't even opened. It was just there one moment and gone the next, like a nightmare fading in the morning light. I stayed in that closet for what felt like hours, my legs cramping and my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. When the other troop finally entered, their normal teenage chatter seemed obscene after what I'd witnessed. Their scoutmaster found me when he heard movement in the closet, probably expecting to catch someone playing a prank. "Son," he said, concern evident in his voice when he saw my state. "Are you all right?" I couldn't speak, could barely shake my head. He must have seen something in my face that worried him because he immediately took charge of the situation, leading me to the private shower in their nearby campsite. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. Couldn't find the words to describe it even if I'd wanted to. The walk back to my own campsite was a blur. The scoutmaster insisted on accompanying me, probably thinking I'd had some kind of panic attack. Maybe I had. But I knew what I'd seen. Knew it was real with the same certainty that I knew my own name. When I got back to my tent, I didn't sleep. I lay there, listening to the sounds outside, jumping at every rustle and crack. Somewhere in the distance I heard that same raspy growl, but it seemed farther away now, as if the thing had found other prey to hunt. The next morning I called my mother from the camp office. I told her I was sick, that I needed to come home. She must have heard something in my voice because she didn't argue, didn't try to convince me to stick it out. She arrived 2 hours later to pick me up. As we drove away from Camp Bucktum's, I watched the trees through the car window. Something moved in the shadows of the forest, something tall and pale that seemed to keep pace with the car for a moment before falling behind. I never told my mother what happened that night. I quit the Boy Scouts the following week, and she didn't fight me on that either. Years have passed since then, but I still think about what I saw in those Tennessee woods. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind moves through the trees just right, I hear that raspy breathing again. And I wonder about all the other kids who've gone to Camp Bucktum since then, if they've seen what I saw, if they've felt those empty eyes watching them from the shadows. Because I know it's still there, waiting in those deep woods, waiting for someone else to walk alone in the gathering dark, to stray just far enough from safety. And if you ever find yourself at Camp Bucktum's, remember this. When the woods go quiet, when you feel those eyes on your back, don't run. They say that's when it likes to chase. Just walk calmly back to your campsite, back to the lights and the voices and the safety of numbers. And whatever you do, don't look behind you. Because sometimes, just sometimes, it's closer than you think. Growing up in the bustling heart of a major metropolis, I never expected to encounter the supernatural. The concrete jungle of skyscrapers and neon lights seemed an unlikely backdrop for ghostly apparitions or paranormal activity. Yet as I would come to learn, the veil between our world and the next is thin everywhere, even in the most unlikely of places. My name is Isabella, and I was born with a birthmark on my right cheek, a small reddish splotch that my mother always said looked like a crescent moon. It wasn't until I was older that I realized this seemingly innocuous mark was far more than a simple quirk of pigmentation. It was a sign of something much deeper, much more ancient, a gift, or perhaps a curse, that ran through the women in my family. My grandmother, Evelyn, had the same mark. So did my great-great-grandmother, Beatrice. It was a pattern that repeated itself, generation after generation, skipping one and manifesting in the next. With the mark came an ability that defied explanation, a sixth sense, if you will, that allowed us to perceive things beyond the realm of ordinary human experience. Growing up, I'd heard whispers of this gift from my mother and aunts. They spoke in hushed tones about Grandma Evelyn's uncanny ability to sense spirits, to see things that others couldn't. As a child, I dismissed these stories as nothing more than family folklore, the kind of tales that get passed down and embellished over time. How wrong I was. It was the summer of 2002 when I first realized that there was more to these stories than mere superstition. I was 6 years old, living in a modest apartment on the 17th floor of a high-rise in the city center. My days were filled with the typical concerns of a child: school, friends, and my ever-demanding Tamagotchi. But as night fell, a different world began to reveal itself to me. Our apartment wasn't large, but it felt cavernous in the dark. The hallway that connected the bedrooms to the living area seemed to stretch on forever, shadows pooling in the corners and doorways. It was in this corridor that I first saw them, the entities that would come to haunt my nights for years to come. I remember that first encounter vividly. It was a warm night in July, and I had gotten up to get a glass of water. As I padded down the hallway, my small feet barely making a sound on the carpet, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was my father. He worked the night shift and often came home in the early hours of the morning. But as I turned to look, I realized with a growing sense of dread that this was not my father at all. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. It was dark, not just in color but in substance, as if it were made of shadows given form. It moved with a strange, swaying motion, like seaweed undulating in an unseen current. And its eyes. God. Its eyes. They were hollow pits of absolute darkness, seeming to draw in what little light there was in the hallway. I stood there, frozen in terror, unable to move or cry out. The entity didn't seem to notice me at first, continuing its bizarre, silent dance down the hallway. Then slowly, its head turned towards me. Those bottomless eyes fixed on mine, and I felt a chill that went beyond mere physical cold. It was as if my very soul was being touched by something ancient and utterly alien. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, the figure turned away and continued its journey, disappearing into the shadows at the end of the hall. I ran back to my room, diving under the covers and squeezing my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them again, the world would make sense once more. But that was just the beginning. Night after night, I would see these shadow figures, their numbers growing, their silent movements becoming more frenzied. And as my fear grew, so did my understanding that I was witnessing something that others could not see. The first manifestation of a gift that would change my life forever. As the weeks turned into months and months into years, the nightly visitations became a terrifying routine. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights flickered to life, I would feel a familiar dread settling in the pit of my stomach. The shadows would come, without fail, their silent parade a macabre spectacle that only I could witness. My days were normal enough. I'd wake up, have breakfast with my dad before he went to sleep, and then head off to school. My mother would pick me up in the afternoon, and we'd spend a few hours together before my father woke up to start his night shift. It was a life of clockwork precision, each day flowing into the next with predictable regularity. But as night fell, that comforting routine would shatter. The first sign was always a drop in temperature. Even on the hottest summer nights, I'd feel a chill creep into the room, raising goosebumps on my arms and sending shivers down my spine. Then the shadows would begin to move. It always started in the hallway. A flicker of movement, barely perceptible at first, like a curtain stirring in a non-existent breeze. Then slowly the shadows would coalesce, taking on those familiar, terrifying forms. Tall, impossibly thin figures, their bodies seeming to bend and sway in ways that defied physics. Their faces, if you could call them that, were featureless save for those haunting, hollow eyes. At first, there was just one. It would glide down the hallway, passing by my partially open door, its gaze never quite meeting mine. But as time went on, more began to appear. 2, then 3, then a veritable parade of shadow figures, all engaged in their silent, swaying dance. I would lie in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst from my chest. I wanted to scream, to call out to my mother for help, but terror had stolen my voice. All I could do was watch, wide-eyed and trembling, as the shadows moved through our home. They never entered my room, thank God, but they were everywhere else. In the hallway, the living room, the kitchen. I could see them through the crack in my door, their dark forms moving back and forth, in an endless, maddening cycle. Sometimes, I'd see one pause by my parents' bedroom door, its head tilting as if listening. In those moments, my fear would reach new heights. What if they went in? What if they did something to my mom and dad? But they never did. They always moved on, continuing their relentless patrol. The worst part was the silence. You'd think that with so many entities moving about, there would be some sound. A whisper, a footstep, anything. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive, suffocating silence of the night, broken only by the distant sounds of the city and my own ragged breathing. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just shadows from passing cars, or tricks of the light from the street lamps outside. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. These figures moved with purpose, with awareness. They were real as the bed I lay in, or the teddy bear I clutched for comfort. As I grew older, I began to notice patterns in their behavior. They seemed to have favorite spots. The corner of the living room where my mother's old rocking chair sat, the space in front of the bathroom mirror, the area around our dining table. They would congregate in these places, their forms overlapping and intertwining in a grotesque dance. And always, there was that feeling of being watched. Even when I couldn't see them directly, I could feel their presence, their hollow eyes boring into me from the darkness. It was a weight on my chest, a constant pressure that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. I began to dread bedtime. While other kids my age begged to stay up late, I would have given anything to sleep through the night, to close my eyes and open them again to find the sun streaming through my window. But that wasn't an option. Night after night, I was forced to witness this terrifying spectacle, powerless to stop it or even understand it. The worst nights were when I'd wake up in the middle of their procession. I'd open my eyes, disoriented from sleep, only to see a shadow figure standing at the foot of my bed, its hollow eyes fixed on me. In those moments, the line between nightmare and reality blurred, and I would lie there, paralyzed with fear, until sleep mercifully claimed me again. As the years passed, the number of shadow figures grew. What started as 1 became 2, then 5, then 8. By the time I was 8 years old, I would sometimes count over a dozen of these entities, all moving through our apartment in their bizarre, silent choreography. I never told my parents about what I saw. How could I? I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, that they'd think I was making it up or that something was wrong with me. And a part of me was terrified that if I spoke about the shadows, I would somehow make them more real, more powerful. So I kept my silence, enduring night after night of terror, watching helplessly as the shadows danced their way through my childhood. But as I would soon learn, silence is not always the best defense against the dark. It was a crisp autumn evening in 2004 when everything changed. I was 8 years old, and the weight of my nightly ordeal had begun to take its toll. My grades were slipping, I was withdrawn at school, and dark circles had taken up permanent residence under my eyes. My parents were worried, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. How do you explain to your mom and dad that your home is invaded every night by shadow people? That particular evening had been especially rough. I'd had a bad day at school, a math test I was sure I'd failed, a fight with my best friend, and to top it off, I'd forgotten my lunch at home. By the time night fell, I was a mess of pent-up emotions, tired, sad, and angry at the world. As usual, the temperature in the apartment dropped as darkness settled in. I lay in bed, waiting for the familiar parade of shadows to begin. But tonight was different. Maybe it was my emotional state, or maybe the entities sensed a change in me, but their movements seemed more frenzied, more purposeful. I watched through the crack in my door as they swept through the hallway, their forms blending and separating in a dizzying dance. 1, 2, 5, 8. I counted them as they passed, their hollow eyes seeming to glow with an inner darkness. But they didn't stop at 8. More came, filling the hallway, spilling into the living room and kitchen. My heart raced as I realized this was the most I'd ever seen at once. 15, 16, 17. The count kept rising. The air felt thick, heavy with their presence. It was hard to breathe, as if the very oxygen was being sucked out of the room. And then I saw it, a shadow figure larger than the rest. It moved differently, with a deliberate slowness that sent chills down my spine. As it approached my door, I felt a wave of terror wash over me. This one was different. This one felt aware. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I was tired of being afraid, tired of sleepless nights and constant terror. In a surge of reckless courage, or perhaps foolishness, I decided I'd had enough. With trembling legs, I climbed out of bed and approached my bedroom door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, but I forced myself to grasp it, to turn it slowly. The door creaked open, and I found myself face to face with the largest shadow figure. My voice was barely a whisper, choked with fear, but I managed to force out the words, "Daddy, is it you?" The effect was immediate and terrifying. Every single shadow figure in sight froze, their swaying movements ceasing in an instant. Then, as one, they all turned to look at me. Dozens of pairs of hollow eyes fixed on my small form in the doorway. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there trembling as the entities stared at me. For the first time, I looked directly into their faces, if you could call them faces. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. Their features were a void, a blackness so deep it seemed to absorb light. But their eyes... oh God, their eyes. They weren't just hollow anymore. They were filled with an awareness, an intelligence that was utterly alien and indescribably terrifying. In that moment, I realized that these weren't just shadows or tricks of the light. These were conscious entities, and they knew that I could see them. The large figure in front of me tilted its head, an eerily human gesture that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into my soul, searching, probing. I felt naked, exposed, as if every secret thought and fear was being laid bare before this otherworldly being. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they began to fade. Like fog dissipating in the morning sun, the shadow figures became translucent, then transparent, before disappearing altogether. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I could breathe again. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the now empty hallway. My mind struggled to process what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was this some sort of waking nightmare? But deep down, I knew the truth. I had confronted the entities that had haunted my nights for years, and in doing so, I had changed something fundamental about our relationship. They knew I could see them, and they had chosen to leave, or at least to hide themselves better. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion hit me like a tidal wave. I crawled back into bed, my mind reeling from the encounter. For the first time in years, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke the next morning, the world seemed different. The apartment felt lighter, cleaner somehow. And though I didn't realize it at the time, that night marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. One where the shadows no longer held complete power over me. The days following my confrontation with the shadow figures were filled with a strange mix of relief and unease. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without interruption. The oppressive atmosphere that had permeated our apartment was gone, replaced by a stillness that was both comforting and slightly unsettling. At first, I was elated. I bounced out of bed each morning, reveling in the feeling of being well rested. My parents noticed the change immediately. The dark circles under my eyes began to fade, and I regained some of the cheerful energy that had been sapped away by years of nightly terrors. "You're looking much better, sweetheart," my mom said one morning over breakfast. "Have you been sleeping better?" I nodded, my mouth full of cereal. I wanted to tell her everything, about the shadows, about my confrontation, about the years of fear I'd endured in silence. But something held me back. A part of me was still afraid that speaking about it would somehow bring the entities back. So I swallowed my words along with my breakfast and simply said, "Yeah, I guess I have." My improved mood and energy levels didn't go unnoticed at school either. My grades began to improve, and I found myself more engaged in class discussions. My best friend, with whom I'd had that fight, approached me one day during recess. "You seem different," she said, studying me with a puzzled expression. "Did something happen?" I shrugged, offering a small smile. "I've just been sleeping better, that's all." But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, a new kind of unease began to creep in. The shadows were gone, yes, but the memory of them lingered. I found myself constantly on edge, expecting to see a dark figure out of the corner of my eye at any moment. Every unexplained sound in the apartment, a creak of the floorboards, the settling of pipes, would send my heart racing. I developed a habit of checking over my shoulder, of peering into dark corners before entering a room. The shadows were gone, but the fear remained. And then there were the dreams. Oh, the dreams. They started about a month after the confrontation. In these nightmares, I was back in that hallway, surrounded by the shadow figures. But this time, they didn't disappear when I spoke. Instead, they converged on me, their cold, empty hands reaching out, their hollow eyes boring into my soul. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. My parents, alarmed by these nightmares, suggested I see a therapist. Dr. Rosenberg was a kind, middle-aged woman with gentle eyes and a soothing voice. In her office, surrounded by potted plants and calming artwork, I found myself opening up about my experiences for the first time. "Tell me about these shadows," she said during our third session, her pen poised over a notepad. I hesitated, then the words came tumbling out. I told her everything, about the nightly visitations, the growing number of entities, the confrontation. As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. It was liberating to finally share my secret, even if I wasn't sure she would believe me. Dr. Rosenberg listened without interruption, her face betraying no judgment or disbelief. When I finished, she set down her pen and leaned forward. "Isabella," she said gently, "what you've been through sounds terrifying. Whether these shadows were real or a manifestation of anxiety, the fear you experienced was very real." She didn't outright dismiss my story as imagination or hallucination, which I appreciated. Instead, she focused on helping me develop coping mechanisms for my anxiety and lingering fear. As the months passed, I began to feel more in control. The nightmares became less frequent, and I found myself less jumpy in the dark. But the experience had changed me fundamentally. I now knew that there were things in this world, or perhaps beyond it, that defied explanation. And I couldn't shake the feeling that my encounter with the shadow figures was just the beginning. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon in the spring of 2006 when I stumbled upon the truth about my family's gift. I was 10 years old, spending the weekend at my grandmother Evelyn's house while my parents attended a wedding out of town. Grandma Evelyn lived in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of the city, a place that had always filled me with a mixture of fascination and unease. The house creaked and groaned, especially on stormy days like this one, and the antique furnishings cast strange shadows in the flickering lamplight. I was in the attic, ostensibly looking for an old board game, when I came across a dusty, leather-bound book tucked away in a corner. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. As I opened it, a slip of paper fell out. A faded photograph of a woman who looked remarkably like my grandmother, but older, her face lined with wrinkles that spoke of a life filled with both joy and hardship. On the back of the photo, in spidery handwriting, was written, "Beatrice Holloway, 1902. The shadows speak to those who listen." My hands trembling, I turned back to the book. It was a journal, filled with entries dating back to the early 1900s. As I began to read, my eyes widened in shock and recognition. April 15th, 1902, the first entry began. "They came again last night. The shadow people. They move through the house as if they own it, their hollow eyes seeing everything. Their silent movements a dance macabre. I sat there, amidst the dust and forgotten relics of the attic, reading entry after entry. Beatrice, my great-great-grandmother, described encounters eerily similar to my own. The shadow figures, the feeling of being watched, the terror that came with the falling of night. But there was more. Beatrice wrote of learning to communicate with the shadows, of understanding their purpose. They were, she believed, guardians of some sort, entities that existed in the space between worlds, watching, waiting, protecting. They are not evil, one entry read, though their appearance may suggest otherwise. They are ancient, older than humanity itself. They guard the veil between worlds, and those of us who can see them are tasked with a great responsibility. As I read on, I learned about the birthmark, the crescent moon on the right cheek that marked those in our family who had the gift of sight. Beatrice had it, as did her granddaughter, my grandmother Evelyn, and now me. I was so engrossed in the journal that I didn't hear the attic door open. It wasn't until a hand gently touched my shoulder that I realized I wasn't alone. I looked up, startled, to see Grandma Evelyn standing there, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I see you found Beatrice's journal," she said softly, lowering herself to sit beside me on the dusty floor. "I suppose it's time we had a talk, Isabella." Over cups of hot cocoa in her cozy kitchen, with rain pattering against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance, Grandma Evelyn told me everything. She confirmed what I had read in the journal, that the women in our family, every other generation, were born with the ability to see beyond the veil of our world. "It's a gift," she said, her wrinkled hands wrapped around her mug. "But it's also a tremendous responsibility. The shadows you've seen, the entities that have frightened you so, they are guardians, Isabella. They protect the boundaries between worlds, and they're drawn to those who can see them." I listened, wide-eyed, as she explained that the confrontation I'd had 2 years ago was a sort of test. By acknowledging the shadows, by showing courage in the face of fear, I had proven myself worthy of the gift. "But why did they leave?" I asked, thinking back to that night. "Why haven't I seen them since?" Grandma Evelyn smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "They didn't leave, dear. They're still there, watching, guarding. But now that you've shown you're ready, they've become more discreet. They won't reveal themselves fully again until you're prepared to take on the responsibility that comes with this gift." As she spoke, I felt a shift in my perception. The fear that had gripped me for so long began to ebb, replaced by a sense of wonder and purpose. The shadows weren't my enemies. They were allies in a cosmic dance I was only beginning to understand. "What responsibility?" I asked, both excited and nervous about the answer. Grandma Evelyn reached out, gently touching the birthmark on my cheek. "To watch," she said softly. "To listen. To stand as a bridge between worlds. The shadows will show you things, Isabella. Things that others can't see. And sometimes, you'll need to act on that knowledge to help maintain the balance." As the storm raged outside, Grandma Evelyn began to teach me about our family's legacy. She told me stories of Beatrice and the women who came before her, of the shadows and the worlds beyond our own. It was the beginning of my true education, the start of a journey that would change my life forever. That night, as I lay in bed in the guest room of Grandma Evelyn's house, I felt a familiar chill in the air. But this time, instead of fear, I felt a sense of anticipation. I opened my eyes to see a shadow figure standing at the foot of my bed, its hollow eyes fixed on me. "I see you," I whispered, my voice steady, "and I'm ready to learn." The figure inclined its head in what seemed like approval, and for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. Instead, I felt like I was on the threshold of something vast and wonderful, a world of shadows and secrets that I was only beginning to understand. The years that followed my discovery in Grandma Evelyn's attic were a whirlwind of learning and adaptation. Armed with the knowledge of my family's legacy, I began to see the world and the shadows in a completely different light. Grandma Evelyn became my mentor, teaching me the ways of our family's gift. Every weekend I would visit her, eagerly absorbing every bit of wisdom she had to offer. We would sit in her garden, surrounded by the heady scent of roses and lavender, as she taught me how to hone my abilities. "The key," she would say, her eyes twinkling with a mix of mischief and wisdom, "is to not just see the shadows, but to feel them. They communicate not through words, but through impressions, emotions, and sometimes visions." I learned to meditate, to quiet my mind and open myself to the whispers of the in-between world. It wasn't easy. There were times when the visions were so intense, so terrifying, that I would come out of my trance shaking and covered in cold sweat. One particular session stands out in my memory. I was 13, sitting cross-legged in Grandma Evelyn's attic, surrounded by candles. As I slipped into a meditative state, the shadows began to swirl around me, taking on forms both familiar and utterly alien. Suddenly, I was no longer in the attic. I found myself standing on a desolate plain, the sky above me a roiling mass of dark clouds. In the distance, I could see a tear in the fabric of reality, a gash in the world that pulsed with an otherworldly light. Shadow figures streamed towards this breach, their movements urgent and purposeful. As I watched, transfixed, I felt a sense of impending doom wash over me. Something was coming through that tear, something that didn't belong in our world. The shadows were fighting to close it, to push back whatever was trying to break through. I woke from the vision with a gasp, my heart pounding. Grandma Evelyn was there, her cool hand on my forehead, her voice soothing as she brought me back to reality. "What you saw," she explained once I had calmed down, "was a glimpse of the shadow's purpose. They guard the boundaries between worlds, preventing things from crossing over that could upset the balance." These visions became more frequent as my training progressed. Sometimes they were glimpses of other worlds, beautiful and terrible in their alienness. Other times, they were warnings of potential breaches, places where the veil between worlds was growing thin. But it wasn't all intense visions and cosmic battles. I also learned to use my gift in smaller, more practical ways. I could sense the lingering emotions in a room, the echoes of past events that clung to places and objects. This ability came in handy in unexpected ways. There was the time I helped my best friend find a cherished locket that had belonged to her grandmother. As soon as I entered her room, I could sense the item's presence, could feel the love and memories attached to it. I was drawn to a corner of the room where the locket had fallen behind a dresser. Or the instance when I sensed a dark, oppressive energy in a new student's home while working on a school project. Through careful questioning, I discovered she was being abused by her stepfather. With my parents' help, we were able to alert the authorities and get her to safety. These small acts of help, guided by my ability to see and sense what others couldn't, gave me a sense of purpose. I was using my gift not just for some grand cosmic balance, but to make a real difference in people's lives. But with this growing power came growing responsibility. The shadows began to appear more frequently, no longer content to simply observe. They would guide me to places where my intervention was needed, showing me visions of people in distress or locations where the veil between worlds was dangerously thin. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. There were nights when I would wake up in a cold sweat, the remnants of a vision clinging to my mind like cobwebs. Days when the constant presence of the shadows left me feeling drained and isolated. My parents, bless them, tried their best to understand. Though they couldn't see what I saw, they supported me in every way they could. My mom would hold me after particularly rough nights, not asking for explanations, just offering comfort. My dad would make light-hearted jokes about having a supernatural early warning system in the family, his humor helping to ease the tension. But despite their love and support, I couldn't shake the feeling of being different, set apart from the normal world. As I entered my teen years, this sense of otherness only grew stronger. While my classmates worried about dates and dances, I was grappling with visions of other worlds and the responsibility of maintaining cosmic balance. There were times when I resented my gift, when I longed for the blissful ignorance of a normal life. But then I would remember Grandma Evelyn's words. With great power comes great responsibility, yes, but also great wonder, and the chance to make a real difference in this world and others. And so I persevered, honing my skills, learning to balance my normal life with my supernatural responsibilities. Little did I know that all of this was merely preparation for the greatest challenge I would face, a threat to not just our world, but to the very fabric of reality itself. As I entered my 16th year, there was a palpable change in the air. The shadows grew more agitated, their movements more frenzied. My visions became more frequent and intense, filled with images of cosmic upheaval and impending doom. It was a crisp autumn evening when everything came to a head. I was walking home from a late study session at the library, the streets quiet save for the rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. As I turned onto my street, I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. The shadows were gathering. They swirled around me, their forms more distinct than I had ever seen them. Their hollow eyes were filled with an urgency that sent my heart racing. Without warning, I was plunged into a vision more vivid and terrifying than any I'd experienced before. I saw our world, but it was wrong, twisted. The sky was a sickly green, pulsing with eldritch energies. Buildings warped and shifted, their architecture defying the laws of physics. And everywhere, there were things. Creatures that should not exist in our reality. Their forms so alien and horrifying that my mind rebelled at the sight of them. In the center of this chaos, I saw a tear in the fabric of reality, a yawning void that pulsed with malevolent energy. Shadow figures fought desperately against a tide of nightmarish entities pouring through the breach, but they were being overwhelmed. As quickly as it had begun, the vision ended. I found myself on my knees on the sidewalk, gasping for breath, cold sweat soaking my clothes. The shadows swirled around me, their movements agitated and purposeful. I stumbled to my feet and ran the rest of the way home. I burst through the front door, startling my parents who were watching TV in the living room. "We need to call Grandma Evelyn," I gasped out. "Now." Within an hour, Grandma Evelyn arrived, her face grave as I recounted my vision. She listened without interruption, her eyes growing more troubled with each word. "It's as we feared," she said when I had finished. "The balance is shifting. Something is trying to break through, something that could destroy not just our world, but countless others." She turned to my parents, who were listening with a mixture of confusion and concern. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "but I need to take Isabella with me. What's coming? She's the only one who can stop it." My parents protested, of course. The idea of their 16-year-old daughter going off to fight some cosmic horror was understandably hard to swallow. But in the end, faced with the gravity of the situation and my own determination, they reluctantly agreed. That night, as I packed a bag with shaking hands, the reality of what I was about to face hit me. I was terrified, yes, but there was also a sense of purpose, of rightness. This was what I had been preparing for all these years, whether I had known it or not. As Grandma Evelyn and I drove through the night, she explained more about what we were facing. "There are places," she said, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, "where the boundaries between worlds are thinner. Places where great power has been wielded or great evil committed. The shadows guard these places, but sometimes something slips through. We were headed to one such place, an abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of the city. According to Grandma Evelyn, it had once been the site of experiments in quantum physics, experiments that had torn holes in the fabric of reality. The shadows have been fighting to keep these breaches closed for years, she explained. But now something on the other side has found a way to force them open. If we don't stop it, our world, and countless others, will be overrun. As we neared our destination, I could feel the wrongness in the air. The shadows here were agitated, moving in patterns I had never seen before. The very air seemed to shimmer and warp, as if the laws of physics were breaking down. We parked some distance away and approached on foot. The industrial complex loomed before us, its abandoned buildings casting long, unnatural shadows in the moonlight. As we drew closer, I could see shadow figures flitting between the structures, their movements frantic and desperate. The air crackled with an otherworldly energy that made my skin crawl. Each step closer to the complex felt like wading through molasses, as if reality itself was resisting our presence. "Isabella," Grandma Evelyn said, her voice tight with tension. "What we're about to face, it's beyond anything you've encountered before. Remember your training. Trust in the shadows and in yourself." I nodded, swallowing hard against the lump of fear in my throat. As we approached the main building, a massive warehouse with broken windows and rusted metal siding, I could feel the wrongness emanating from within. It was like a black hole of negative energy, sucking in everything around it. We pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The interior was a nightmare of twisted metal and pulsing, otherworldly light. In the center of the warehouse floor, a tear in reality hung suspended in the air. It was like looking at a rip in the fabric of the world, edges jagged and pulsing with sickly green energy. Shadow figures swarmed around the breach, their forms stretching and distorting as they fought to keep it closed. But it was a losing battle. As we watched, horror-struck, a tentacle of pure darkness snaked through the opening, followed by another and another. "It's coming through," Grandma Evelyn whispered, her face pale in the eerie light. "Isabella, you know what you have to do." I did know, though the knowledge filled me with terror. I had to use my gift, my connection to the shadows, to help seal the breach. But doing so would put me in direct contact with whatever was on the other side. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward. The shadows swirled around me, their cold touch familiar and almost comforting. I closed my eyes and opened my mind, reaching out to connect with the guardian entities. The moment I made contact, I was assaulted by a wave of alien thoughts and emotions. The shadows were ancient, their consciousness vast and incomprehensible. But underlying it all was a sense of desperate urgency. They needed my help. Guided by instinct and years of training, I began to weave my consciousness with theirs. I could feel the power building, a force that transcended the physical world. Together, we pushed against the encroaching darkness, fighting to close the breach. The entity on the other side fought back. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, striking at my mind with terrifying force. Images flooded my consciousness, worlds consumed by chaos, realities twisted beyond recognition, an endless hunger that threatened to devour everything. I screamed, the sound lost in the howling vortex of energy that surrounded us. The pain was excruciating, like my very soul was being torn apart. But I couldn't give up. The fate of not just our world, but countless others, hung in the balance. Drawing on every ounce of strength I possessed, I pushed back against the darkness. I thought of my family, my friends, of all the people I'd helped with my gift. I thought of the beauty of our world, of all the worlds I'd glimpsed in my visions. And I thought of the shadows, the ancient guardians who had watched over reality for eons. With a final desperate surge of will, we forced the breach closed. There was a sound like reality itself screaming, and then silence. I opened my eyes to find myself lying on the cold concrete floor of the warehouse. Grandma Evelyn was kneeling beside me, tears streaming down her face. The shadows swirled around us, their movements now calm and almost grateful. "You did it, Isabella," Grandma Evelyn whispered, helping me sit up. "You closed the breach." As the reality of what had just happened sank in, I felt a mix of exhaustion, relief, and something else. A sense of completion. I had faced my greatest challenge and against all odds, had emerged victorious. But as we made our way out of the warehouse on shaky legs, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The entity we had forced back. It was still out there, still hungry. And there were other weak points in reality. Other places where the veil between worlds was thin. Our battle was won, but the war was far from over. In the days and weeks that followed the incident at the warehouse, life took on a surreal quality. On the surface, everything seemed normal. I went back to school, hung out with friends, did my homework. But underneath it all was the knowledge that I had faced down a cosmic horror and lived to tell the tale. The shadows were ever present, but they were different now. There was a new respect in the way they moved around me. A sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there before. They were no longer just entities I could see. They were allies, comrades in arms. Grandma Evelyn stepped up my training, pushing me to develop my abilities further. "What happened at the warehouse was just the beginning," she would say, her eyes serious. "We need to be prepared for what might come next." And so I trained. I learned to project my consciousness across vast distances, to see through the eyes of shadows half a world away. I honed my ability to sense disturbances in reality, to feel the ebb and flow of energies most humans couldn't even comprehend. But it wasn't all cosmic battles and interdimensional threats. There were still the day-to-day uses of my gift, the small ways I could help people in my community. I helped the police locate missing persons, using my ability to sense lingering emotions and memories. I counseled people dealing with hauntings or unexplained phenomena, using my knowledge to bring them peace. One particularly memorable case involved a young girl who was terrified of her own shadow. Her parents had taken her to doctors and therapists, but nothing seemed to help. When they came to me, desperate for any solution, I immediately sensed the problem. The girl's fear wasn't irrational. Her shadow really was alive, in a sense. A minor spirit had attached itself to her, drawn by her natural sensitivity to the supernatural. With the help of the shadow guardians, I was able to communicate with the spirit and convince it to move on. The look of relief on the girl's face when she realized her shadow was just a shadow again was something I'll never forget. It was moments like these that made all the danger and responsibility worthwhile. But even as I helped others and continued my training, I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen through the breach. The entity we had forced back. It was still out there, waiting. I could feel it sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night. A malevolent presence pressing against the barriers of our reality, searching for another way in. Grandma Evelyn sensed my unease. "The battle is never truly over, Isabella," she told me one evening as we sat in her garden, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun set. "That's the burden of our gift. We stand as guardians, always vigilant, always ready." I nodded, understanding the weight of her words. This was my life now, not just a high school student with an unusual ability, but a protector of reality itself. It was a heavy responsibility, but one I was prepared to bear. As if in response to my thoughts, the shadows around us stirred. I felt a familiar chill run down my spine and knew that somewhere, the veil between worlds was growing thin once again. I stood up, brushing off my jeans. Grandma Evelyn looked at me, a mixture of pride and concern in her eyes. Ready? She asked. I took a deep breath, feeling the power of the shadows swirling around me, through me. I thought of all I had learned, all I had experienced. I thought of the entity waiting in the darkness between worlds, and of all the people, in this world and others, who were counting on me, even if they didn't know it. Ready, I replied. As we headed off into the gathering dusk, I couldn't help but smile. This was my life now. Strange, terrifying, wondrous, and more important than I could have ever imagined. The shadows were my allies, the space between worlds my battlefield, and the safety of reality my responsibility. It wasn't the life I had expected, but it was mine, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The harsh glow of my smartphone screen illuminated the dark interior of my weathered 2010 Honda Civic. It was 11:43 p.m. on a crisp October night in 2023, and I had just accepted what would be my final ride request of the evening. As I navigated through the rain-slicked streets of Pinewood, Oregon, I couldn't help but reflect on how I'd ended up here, a 34-year-old man reduced to chauffeuring strangers around in the dead of night. 3 years earlier, I had been laid off from my steady office job at a local printing company. With bills piling up and no promising leads in sight, I turned to Uber as a temporary solution. Just until I find something better, I told myself. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and before I knew it, I had become a full-time rideshare driver. The job had taken its toll on both me and my car. My once pristine Civic now bore the battle scars of countless late-night passengers, mysterious stains on the upholstery, cigarette burns on the armrests, and a pervasive odor that no amount of air freshener could mask. The vehicle's mileage had skyrocketed, and strange rattles and creaks had become my constant companions on the road. But it wasn't just the physical wear and tear that weighed on me. The mental strain of dealing with an endless parade of strangers, some pleasant, many indifferent, and a few downright hostile, had left me feeling hollowed out. I'd been cursed at, threatened, and even had a drunk passenger vomit all over my back seat. Each incident chipped away at my faith in humanity, leaving me increasingly bitter and isolated. As I pulled into the parking lot of Gus's Burger Shack, my favorite greasy spoon and frequent haunt during slow nights, I let out a weary sigh. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie red glow across the rain-dampened pavement. I parked in my usual spot, killed the engine, and leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes for just a moment. The ping of a new ride request jolted me awake. I blinked, disoriented, and fumbled for my phone. The clock now read 11:52 p.m. I must have dozed off for a few minutes. Squinting at the screen, I saw that the pickup location was only a few blocks away. My finger hovered over the accept button as I debated whether to call it a night or squeeze in one last fare. Financial desperation won out over my better judgment. I accepted the ride and pulled out of the parking lot, unaware that I was driving towards a nightmare that would forever change the course of my life. The streets were nearly deserted as I made my way to the pickup location. A light drizzle had started, creating a misty haze that distorted the glow of the streetlights. As I turned onto Maple Street, a sense of unease began to creep over me. This part of town had seen better days, with boarded-up storefronts and graffiti-covered walls telling a story of urban decay. I slowly rolled to a stop in front of a dilapidated convenience store, its windows dark and its neon open sign long since burned out. My eyes darted around, searching for my passenger. That's when I saw him emerge from the shadows of a nearby alley. Even from a distance, something about the man's appearance set off alarm bells in my mind. He moved with an erratic, twitchy gait, his head snapping from side to side as if he were looking for unseen pursuers. As he drew closer, I could make out more details that only heightened my apprehension. The man appeared to be in his late 40s or early 50s, with a shaved head that gleamed dully in the weak light. dark sunglasses obscured his eyes, despite the late hour and gloomy weather. His clothes were a study in contrasts. Skin-tight black jeans that seemed to have been painted onto his lean frame, paired with an oversized, tattered hoodie riddled with holes and tears. As he reached for the car door, I noticed his hands were trembling. A voice in the back of my mind screamed at me to drive away, to cancel the ride and go home. But years of financial struggle and the ingrained habit of people-pleasing kept me rooted to the spot. The rear door opened, and a wave of foul odor washed over me. A nauseating mixture of body odor, stale cigarettes, and something chemical I couldn't quite place. The man slid into the back seat directly behind me, and I felt the car dip under his weight. Hello? I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. How are you tonight? My greeting was met with silence, save for a low, continuous mumbling. I strained my ears, trying to make out words, but the sounds coming from the back seat were like no language I'd ever heard before. It was a guttural, rhythmic chanting that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Fighting to maintain my composure, I pulled away from the curb and began driving towards the destination displayed on my phone. As we traveled, the mumbling grew louder, punctuated by occasional twitches and jerks that I could feel through my seat. I cranked up the volume on the radio, desperate to drown out the unsettling sounds from my passenger. But even as the familiar melodies filled the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a terrible, potentially fatal mistake. The rhythmic sweep of windshield wipers cut through the intensifying rain as I navigated the empty streets. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I could feel beads of cold sweat forming on my forehead. Every few seconds, my eyes would dart to the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of my unnerving passenger. His twitching had become more pronounced, his entire body seeming to vibrate with barely contained energy. The mumbling had taken on a fevered pitch, rising and falling in a discordant melody that set my teeth on edge. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my mind kept conjuring up increasingly terrifying scenarios. Was he on drugs? Mentally ill? Or something far worse that I couldn't even begin to comprehend? The possibilities swirled in my mind, each more frightening than the last. As we turned onto a residential street lined with rundown houses, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the rearview mirror, I saw my passenger's hand disappear into the pocket of his tattered hoodie. When it re-emerged, I caught a glint of metal that could only be one thing: a knife. My heart began to race, and I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I desperately tried to think of a way out of this situation. Should I slam on the brakes and run? Try to reason with him? Call for help? But before I could act on any of these impulses, we had arrived at our destination. I pulled up in front of a derelict house with boarded-up windows and an overgrown lawn. A weathered "For Rent" sign swayed in the wind, creaking ominously. The street was dark and deserted, with no signs of life in any of the neighboring homes. "We're here," I managed to croak out, my voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you have a good..." My words were cut short by a sudden, sharp pain in my side. It took my brain a moment to process what was happening. The knife I had seen earlier was now buried in my flesh, just below my ribcage. A strong arm snaked around my throat, cutting off my air supply. I gasped and choked, my hands instinctively flying up to claw at the arm restraining me. Through the haze of pain and panic, I could hear my attacker's voice, no longer mumbling but shouting in that same incomprehensible language. The words, though foreign to my ears, dripped with malice and rage. Spittle hit the back of my neck as he screamed, his grip tightening with each passing second. I could feel warm blood soaking through my shirt, spreading across the driver's seat. In that moment, as the edges of my vision began to darken, I was certain I was going to die. All the missed opportunities, the dreams I'd never pursued, the loved ones I'd neglected, they all flashed before my eyes in a cruel montage of regret. But something deep within me, some primal survival instinct, refused to give up. With the last reserves of my strength, I reached down and grabbed the arm holding the knife, preventing my attacker from withdrawing the blade for another strike. What followed was a desperate struggle for survival, played out in the confines of my battered Honda Civic on a lonely, rain-soaked street in the middle of the night. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as I fought for my life in the cramped confines of my car. Every second felt like an eternity, each breath a monumental effort as I battled against the arm crushing my windpipe. The pain in my side was excruciating, a white-hot agony that threatened to overwhelm me. I could feel my attacker trying to wrench the knife free, no doubt intending to plunge it into me again. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I clung to his arm, my fingers digging into his flesh hard enough to draw blood. He howled in rage, a sound more animal than human, and redoubled his efforts to break free. The car rocked violently as we grappled, my blood smearing across the upholstery and dashboard. The coppery scent filled my nostrils, mixing with the attacker's foul body odor to create a nauseating cocktail. I gagged, struggling to breathe through the chokehold and the overwhelming stench. My vision began to tunnel, black spots dancing at the edges of my sight. In desperation, I slammed my head back, feeling a satisfying crunch as my skull connected with my assailant's nose. His grip on my throat loosened for just a moment, allowing me to gulp down a precious breath of air. Taking advantage of his momentary disorientation, I fumbled for the door handle with my free hand. If I could just get out of the car, maybe I'd have a chance. But as my fingers closed around the handle, I felt a sharp yank on my hair, pulling my head back at a painful angle. No escape. A raspy voice hissed in my ear, the first coherent words I'd heard from him. His breath was hot against my skin, reeking of decay and madness. You're mine now. Forever. A fresh wave of terror washed over me at these words. What did he mean by forever? What sick, twisted plans did this lunatic have for me? The thought gave me a burst of desperate energy, and I thrashed wildly, my elbow connecting solidly with his ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip faltering just enough for me to wrench the door open. Cold, rain-soaked air rushed in, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside the car. I half fell, half tumbled out onto the wet pavement, the knife still embedded in my side, sending shockwaves of agony through my body with every movement. For a moment, I lay there gasping, the cool rain mingling with my sweat and blood. Then I heard the rear door open, and adrenaline surged through me once more. Ignoring the screaming protest of my wounded body, I scrambled to my feet and began to run. My attacker's footsteps pounded behind me, accompanied by that same incomprehensible chanting, now raised to a frenzied pitch. I darted between parked cars, my bare feet slapping against the wet asphalt. Each impact sent jolts of pain through my side, but fear drove me onward. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The man was gaining on me, his face twisted into a rictus of inhuman rage. In the dim streetlight, I could see that his sunglasses had been knocked off during our struggle, revealing eyes that glowed with an unnatural, phosphorescent light. A scream tore from my throat, equal parts pain and terror. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning as I sprinted down the deserted street. In the distance, I could see the welcoming glow of a 24-hour gas station. If I could just make it there, maybe I'd be safe. But with each step, I could feel my strength ebbing. The knife in my side felt like it was on fire, and my vision was starting to blur. The gas station seemed impossibly far away, growing more distant with each labored breath. Just as I felt my legs begin to give out, headlights appeared around the corner. A car was approaching, its horn blaring as the driver spotted my stumbling form in the road. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The car screeched to a halt beside me, and I nearly wept with relief as I saw the taxi sign on its roof. The driver, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, took one look at my blood-soaked shirt and pale face before throwing open the passenger door. "Get in!" she shouted, her eyes wide with alarm. I didn't need to be told twice. I dove into the taxi, slamming the door behind me just as my pursuer's fingers grazed the back of my shirt. The driver floored the accelerator and we peeled away from the curb with a squeal of tires. As we sped off into the night, I twisted in my seat to look out the rear window. My attacker stood in the middle of the road, his glowing eyes fixed on the retreating taxi. Even through the closed windows and the sound of the engine, I could hear his unearthly howl of frustration echoing through the night. I slumped back in the seat, my body trembling uncontrollably as the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me weak and disoriented. The knife was still lodged in my side, a constant throbbing reminder of how close I'd come to death. "Hospital," I managed to croak out to the driver, who was already dialing 911 on her cell phone. "Please, hospital." As the taxi sped through the rain-slicked streets towards the nearest emergency room, I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. But all I could see was the image of those glowing eyes, and all I could hear was that inhuman voice whispering, "You're mine now. Forever." The emergency room was a blur of bright lights, urgent voices, and sharp sensations. I drifted in and out of consciousness as doctors and nurses swarmed around me, their words a jumbled mess in my pain-addled brain. At some point, I was wheeled into surgery, the knife finally removed from my side under the harsh glare of operating room lights. When I fully came to, I found myself in a sterile hospital room. The steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell were a stark contrast to the nightmarish events of the previous night. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a terrible dream. But the dull ache in my side and the bandages wrapped around my torso were undeniable proof of the horror I had endured. A kind-faced nurse noticed I was awake and came to check on me. "You're a lucky man," she said, adjusting my IV drip. "The knife missed your vital organs by mere centimeters, a little to the left, and—" She trailed off, her expression grim. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw and painful, a lingering reminder of the chokehold I'd been subjected to. The nurse offered me some ice chips, which I gratefully accepted. As the cool slivers melted on my tongue, I became aware of 2 police officers standing just outside my room, speaking in hushed tones. One of them, a grizzled detective with salt and pepper hair, entered the room. He introduced himself as Detective Hawkins and asked if I felt up to answering some questions. I nodded weakly, eager to help catch the maniac who had attacked me. But as I recounted the events of the night, I could see skepticism growing in the detective's eyes. When I described my attacker's glowing eyes and incomprehensible language, Hawkins exchanged a look with his partner that I recognized all too well. They clearly thought I was either hallucinating or lying. "Mr. Wilson," Detective Hawkins said, his tone carefully neutral, "I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but are you certain about these unusual details? The glowing eyes, the strange language. It's possible that the stress and blood loss may have affected your perception of events." I felt a surge of frustration and fear. They had to believe me. If they didn't take my account seriously, how would they ever catch this monster? "I know how it sounds," I insisted, my voice hoarse and weak, "but I'm telling you the truth. Every word of it." Hawkins nodded, but I could see he wasn't convinced. He asked a few more questions about the ride request, the route we'd taken, and any identifying features I could remember about my attacker. I provided as much detail as I could, desperately hoping that something would lead them to the truth. As the detective was wrapping up, a thought struck me. "My car," I said suddenly. "There must be evidence in my car. Blood, fingerprints, something." "We've already impounded your vehicle," Hawkins replied. "Our forensics team is going over it with a fine-tooth comb. But I have to warn you, Mr. Wilson, the results so far are inconclusive." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, inconclusive?" Hawkins hesitated, then seemed to decide that honesty was the best approach. "The blood we found in the car is all yours. There are no fingerprints other than your own. No hair, no fibers. Nothing to suggest anyone else was in that vehicle last night. I felt the room start to spin. How was this possible? I knew what had happened. I had the knife wound to prove it. But if there was no evidence of my attacker... "Get some rest, Mr. Wilson," Hawkins said, moving towards the door. "We'll be in touch if we need any further information." As the detective left, I sank back into my pillows, my mind reeling. Was I going crazy? Had the stress of my job, the financial struggles, the late nights finally taken their toll on my sanity? But no, the pain in my side was real. The terror I had felt was real. I closed my eyes, trying to make sense of it all. But as soon as my lids shut, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me. I jerked awake with a gasp, my heart racing. It was then that I noticed something on the small table beside my bed, something that hadn't been there before. A small, crumpled piece of paper with words scrawled in jagged, unfamiliar script. With trembling hands, I reached out and unfolded it. The message was short, written in English, but in a hand so shaky it was barely legible. "Not over. Mine forever. See you soon." My blood ran cold as I realized the implications. He had been here, in my hospital room, while I slept. The monster who had tried to kill me had somehow managed to slip past the police, the hospital security, and leave this chilling message. I jabbed frantically at the call button, needing to alert someone, anyone, to this new development. But as a nurse rushed in, responding to my apparent distress, I looked down at my hands and felt my stomach drop. The note was gone. The days that followed my release from the hospital were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every unexpected sound sent my heart racing. I had moved in with my sister Megan, unable to face the prospect of being alone in my small apartment. She had been horrified by my ordeal and insisted I stay with her until I felt safe again. But would I ever truly feel safe again? The police investigation had hit a dead end. With no physical evidence and my increasingly questionable testimony, they had little to go on. Detective Hawkins had gently suggested that I seek counseling to deal with the trauma of the attack. It was clear he believed that my memories of glowing eyes and inhuman chanting were nothing more than stress-induced delusions. I knew better. The note in the hospital, even if it had vanished before anyone else could see it, was proof that this was far from over. My attacker was still out there, watching, waiting for his chance to finish what he'd started. Megan did her best to help me recover both physically and mentally. She cooked nourishing meals, changed my bandages, and listened patiently as I recounted my fears. But I could see the worry in her eyes, the way she'd glance at me when she thought I wasn't looking. She was afraid too, not of my attacker, but of what this trauma might be doing to my mind. One night, about 2 weeks after the attack, I woke suddenly, drenched in sweat. The nightmare had been vivid. I was back in my car, the knife sliding into my flesh over and over again as those glowing eyes bored into my soul. As I lay there trying to calm my racing heart, a sound from outside the window caught my attention. It was that chanting, that same guttural rhythmic sound I'd heard in the car. My blood turned to ice in my veins as I slowly turned my head towards the window. There, pressed against the glass, was a face, pale, hairless, with eyes that glowed an unearthly green in the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to move or call for help as the face leered at me. Its mouth opened in a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. "Mine," it mouthed silently. "Forever." Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the face was gone. I lay there, shaking uncontrollably, for what felt like hours. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, I finally found the strength to stumble out of bed and wake Megan. She listened to my panicked account with growing alarm, then insisted on calling the police. Officers arrived within the hour, but their search of the property turned up nothing. No footprints in the soft earth beneath the window, no signs of disturbance anywhere. Mr. Wilson, the lead officer said gently, is it possible you were having a particularly vivid nightmare? Given what you've been through, it would be perfectly understandable. I wanted to scream at him, to make him understand that this was real, that I was in genuine danger. But the words died in my throat as I saw the pitying looks exchanged between the officers and my sister. They thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. In the days that followed, I barely slept. I spent hours researching obscure languages, trying to find anything that matched the chanting I'd heard. I scoured news reports for any similar attacks, any mention of glowing eyes or inhuman assailants. But my searches yielded nothing but conspiracy theories and horror movie plots. Megan tried to convince me to see a therapist, but I refused. How could I explain this to a mental health professional without sounding completely insane? Instead, I threw myself into my online work, desperate for any distraction from the constant fear that plagued me. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination, a part of me knew the truth. The monster was real, and it wasn't finished with me yet. One evening, about a month after the attack, Megan had to leave for a late shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. I assured her I'd be fine on my own for a few hours, even managing a weak smile as she hesitated at the door. As soon as she was gone, I double-checked all the locks and settled in front of my laptop, determined to distract myself with work until she returned. But as the hours ticked by, an odd sensation began to creep over me. The air in the apartment felt heavier, charged with an unseen energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A soft scratching sound from the hallway outside the apartment door made me freeze. It could have been anything. A neighbor's cat. The building settling. But deep down, I knew. He had found me. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. I could hear that chanting again, muffled but unmistakable. My eyes darted around the room, looking for a weapon, an escape route, anything. But I knew it was futile. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. It wouldn't be stopped by locked doors or desperate pleas. As the door began to splinter under an inhuman assault, I closed my eyes and waited for the inevitable. The chanting grew louder, drowning out the sound of my own terrified heartbeat. In those final moments, as the door gave way with a deafening crack, I found myself wishing I'd never accepted that fateful ride request. If only I'd trusted my instincts, if only I'd driven away when I first saw him emerge from that alley. But it was too late for regrets now. The last thing I saw as I opened my eyes was a pair of glowing green orbs floating in the darkness, drawing closer and closer. Then, mercifully, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I found myself in complete darkness, lying on a cold, damp surface. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else. Something ancient and utterly alien. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I became aware of movement around me. Shadowy figures flitted at the edges of my vision, accompanied by that same chanting I'd come to dread. I tried to move, but my limbs felt leaden, unresponsive. Suddenly, a face loomed over me. The face of my attacker. But in the dim light, I could see him clearly for the first time, and what I saw made my blood run cold. His skin was a sickly shade of gray, stretched taut over an elongated skull. Those glowing eyes were set deep in sunken sockets, and his mouth was filled with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. He spoke, and to my shock, I understood him. "Welcome, Chosen One," he hissed, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. "You have been selected for a great purpose." "What? What are you?" I managed to croak out, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature's mouth twisted into what might have been a smile. "We are the Watchers," he said. "We have existed in the shadows of your world for millennia, guiding humanity's evolution from the darkness." As he spoke, memories began to flood back. Not just of the attack, but of things I'd never experienced. I saw flashes of ancient civilizations, of dark rituals performed in hidden places. I saw beings like my captor walking among humans, whispering secrets and sowing chaos. Your kind calls us by many names, the creature continued. Demons, aliens, monsters, but we are so much more. We are the shapers of your destiny, the architects of your nightmares. I wanted to scream, to deny the impossible truths being revealed to me. But deep down, I knew he was right. Somehow, I had always known. Why me? I asked, dreading the answer. The creature's eyes seemed to glow brighter. You were chosen long ago, marked from birth for this moment. Your bloodline carries a unique genetic marker, one that makes you compatible with our kind. Horror washed over me as I began to understand the implications of his words. Compatible? What do you mean? You will be the bridge, he said, reaching out a long, clawed hand to caress my face. I recoiled from his touch, but found myself unable to move away. Through you, our races will merge. You will be the progenitor of a new species, one that will rule both our worlds. Tears streamed down my face as the full weight of my situation hit me. This wasn't just about me anymore. The fate of humanity itself hung in the balance. I won't do it, I said, trying to inject strength into my voice. I'll die before I help you. The creature's laughter was like breaking glass. Oh, my dear chosen one, he said, leaning in close. You don't have a choice. As he spoke, I felt a sharp pain in my side, right where the knife had pierced me weeks ago. The wound, which had been healing well, suddenly felt like it was on fire. I screamed in agony as the creature placed his hand over the injury. The seed has already been planted, he said, his voice almost gentle now. Even now it grows within you. Soon you will become one of us, the first of a new breed. I thrashed against my invisible bonds, desperate to escape, to wake up from this nightmare. But with each passing moment, I could feel something changing inside me. My vision sharpened, colors becoming more vivid. I could hear the thoughts of the other creatures in the room, a cacophony of alien minds pressing against my consciousness. No, I whimpered, feeling my humanity slipping away with each passing second. Please, no. But my pleas fell on deaf ears. As the transformation took hold, I felt my mind expanding, filling with knowledge and memories that spanned eons. I saw the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of stars. I saw the true history of our world, a history in which humanity was little more than cattle, bred and cultivated by these otherworldly beings for their own inscrutable purposes. And through it all, one thought echoed in my mind, growing louder until it drowned out everything else. Mine now. Forever. I don't know how long I've been here, in this dark, damp place that exists somewhere between realities. Time has lost all meaning. Days, weeks, months, they blur together in an endless cycle of pain and transformation. My body is no longer my own. I watch with detached horror as my skin takes on a grayish hue, as my fingers elongate into wicked claws. The wound in my side has become a pulsing, organic thing, a gateway through which the alien essence floods my system. But it's the changes to my mind that truly terrify me. Memories that aren't my own crowd, my consciousness. Ancient wars fought in the shadows of human history. Cosmic truths that no mortal mind was meant to comprehend. I can feel my human identity slipping away, replaced by something vast and unknowable. The beings, the Watchers, as they call themselves, come and go, performing arcane rituals and speaking in that guttural language that I now understand all too well. They treat me with a mixture of reverence and clinical detachment, as if I'm both a messiah and a lab rat. Sometimes, in moments of lucidity, I think of Megan. I wonder if she's looking for me, if she's realized the truth about what happened that night. I hope she's given up, moved on with her life. The alternative, that she might still be searching, might one day cross paths with these creatures, is too horrible to contemplate. I try to hold on to my humanity, to remember who I was before all this. But it's getting harder with each passing moment. The alien thoughts are becoming my thoughts. The inhuman desires are becoming my desires. And then, one day, or night, it's impossible to tell down here, everything changes. The pain that has been my constant companion suddenly intensifies, becoming an all-consuming agony that tears a scream from my throat. My body contorts, bones cracking and reforming, muscles tearing and re-knitting. I feel as if I'm being turned inside out, every atom of my being unmade and reshaped. The Watchers gather around me, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. Through the haze of pain, I see anticipation in their glowing eyes. This is what they've been waiting for. Just when I think I can't take any more, when I'm certain that death would be a sweet release, everything goes still. The pain vanishes as suddenly as it came, leaving me gasping on the cold stone floor. For a moment, there's silence. Then, slowly, I open my eyes. The world has changed. Or perhaps I have. Colors I've never seen before dance at the edges of my vision. I can hear the thoughts of the creatures around me as clearly as if they were speaking aloud. And when I look down at my hands, I see skin that shimmers with an otherworldly iridescence, fingers tipped with razor-sharp claws. "Welcome, Firstborn," the leader of the Watchers says, extending a hand to help me up. "How do you feel?" I open my mouth to speak, and the voice that emerges is not my own. It's deeper, resonant with power that makes the very air tremble. "I feel complete," I say, and part of me recoils at the truth in those words. But that part is small now, a fading echo of the man I once was. The new me, the hybrid, the bridge between two worlds, rises to its full height and surveys its domain. I can feel the power thrumming through my veins, the knowledge of ages at my fingertips. The vastness of the cosmos unfolds before my mind's eye, revealing secrets that would drive a human mad. But I am no longer human. The Watchers bow before me, their new leader, their messiah. I can sense their thoughts, a mixture of awe, fear, and anticipation. They have waited eons for this moment, for the birth of a being that bridges their world and ours. As I take in my surroundings with my new, enhanced senses, I realize we are in a vast underground chamber. The walls are covered in intricate carvings, depicting the history of the Watchers' interaction with humanity. I can read them now, understanding the complex symbology that tells a tale of manipulation and cultivation spanning millennia. "What now?" I ask, my new voice still strange to my ears. The leader of the Watchers steps forward. "Now, Firstborn, we begin the next phase. You will return to the surface world, to live among the humans as one of them, but you will carry our essence, our power. You will prepare the way for our emergence." A small part of me, the last remnant of my humanity, recoils at the idea. But that voice is drowned out by the chorus of alien minds now inhabiting my consciousness. I nod, accepting my role in this cosmic drama. The next few days, or perhaps weeks, time still holds little meaning here, are spent in preparation. The Watchers teach me to control my new abilities, to shield my true nature from human perception. I learn to shift my form, to appear as I once did, though it feels like wearing an ill-fitting suit. Finally, the day of my return arrives. As I prepare to leave the underground chamber, the leader of the Watchers approaches me one last time. "Remember?" he says, his glowing eyes boring into mine. "You are the vanguard. The success of our plan rests on your shoulders. Do not fail us." I nod, feeling the weight of this responsibility settle over me like a shroud. Then, with a thought, I shift my appearance back to that of the human I once was. The transformation is unsettling. I can feel my power being compressed, hidden away beneath a veneer of mortality. I ascend through winding tunnels, eventually emerging in a derelict building on the outskirts of the city. The sunlight, even filtered through grimy windows, is almost painful after so long in darkness. I blink, adjusting to the sensory assault of the human world. As I step out onto the street, I'm struck by how alien everything feels. The bustle of the city, once so familiar, now seems chaotic and primitive. Humans rush past, unaware of the cosmic horror walking among them, oblivious to the fate that awaits their species. I make my way to Megan's apartment, knowing that my disappearance would have been reported, that questions will need to be answered. As I approach her door, I can hear her inside, her thoughts a jumble of grief and worry. For a moment, I hesitate. Perhaps it would be kinder to let her think me dead, to spare her the horror of what I've become. But my new nature is cold, calculating. Maintaining connections to my old life will be crucial for the success of our plan. So I knock, steeling myself for the performance ahead. The door flies open, and Megan stands there, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Oh my God," she whispers, reaching out a trembling hand to touch my face. "Is it really you?" I force my lips into a smile, ignoring the revulsion I feel at her touch. "It's me, Meg," I say, my voice a perfect imitation of my old self. "I'm home." She collapses into my arms, sobbing with relief. Over her shoulder, I catch a glimpse of my reflection in a mirror. For a split second, I see my true form: gray skin, glowing eyes, inhuman features. Then the illusion snaps back into place, and I'm looking at the face of the man I used to be. As I hold my sister, murmuring comforting lies about where I've been, a part of me marvels at the perfection of our plan. I will live among them, undetected. I will work and laugh and love as they do. And all the while, I will be preparing for the day when the veils between worlds fall, and the true masters of this planet reclaim their dominion. The coming months and years will be a delicate balancing act. I must maintain my human connections while slowly, subtly influencing events to pave the way for the Watcher's arrival. It will require patience, cunning, and an unwavering commitment to our cause. But as I stand there, cradling my weeping sister, feeling nothing but cold detachment, I know I'm more than equal to the task. After all, I am the firstborn, the bridge between worlds, and this planet, with its teeming billions of oblivious humans, is now mine. Forever. 5 years have passed since that fateful night when a simple Uber ride changed the course of human history. To the outside world, I am a success story, a man who survived a brutal attack and turned his life around. I no longer drive for Uber. Instead, I've leveraged my near-death experience into a lucrative career as a motivational speaker and self-help guru. My message of resilience and personal transformation resonates with millions. Little do they know that the transformation I preach is merely a shadow of the cosmic metamorphosis I've undergone. With each passing day, my influence grows. Politicians seek my counsel. Business leaders hang on my every word. The masses devour my books and flock to my seminars. And all the while, beneath the surface, the true work continues. The Watchers remain hidden, but their numbers grow. I've identified others with the genetic marker that makes them compatible for transformation. One by one, they are brought into the fold, changed as I was. We move through society like a virus, infecting key positions of power, preparing the world for the day of emergence. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I remember the man I used to be. The struggling Uber driver, scraping by from ride to ride, dreaming of a better life. In a twisted way, I suppose I've achieved that dream. I now hold the fate of an entire species in my hands. But those moments of reflection are fleeting. The alien consciousness that now dominates my being has little time for human sentimentality. There is work to be done, a cosmic plan to be fulfilled. As I stand before a packed auditorium, thousands of eager faces turn towards me. I feel a surge of cold amusement. They hang on my every word, desperate for guidance, for meaning in their small, insignificant lives. If only they knew the truth, that their world is built on a lie, that their history is a carefully constructed facade. I begin my speech, the words flowing smoothly, designed to inspire and motivate. But beneath the veneer of human platitudes, a deeper message pulses. With each carefully chosen phrase, each subtle gesture, I am programming them, preparing their minds for the paradigm shift to come. We stand on the brink of a new era, I tell them, my eyes scanning the crowd. Here and there I spot them, others like me, hiding in plain sight. We exchange imperceptible nods, a silent acknowledgement of our shared purpose. The world as we know it is about to change. Are you ready to be part of that change? The crowd roars its approval, blind to the true meaning of my words. As their cheers wash over me, I allow myself a small smile. Yes, the world is about to change, but not in any way these poor, doomed humans could possibly imagine. The watchers are patient. They have waited millennia for this moment, but soon, very soon, the waiting will be over. The veil between worlds will fall, and a new age will dawn on Earth. And I, once a simple Uber driver, will stand at the forefront of this cosmic revolution. The architect of humanity's future. The bridge between two worlds. The firstborn. As I bring my speech to a close, earning a standing ovation, a final thought crosses my mind. I wonder what became of the detective who investigated my attack all those years ago. Did he ever suspect the truth? Does he lie awake at night, haunted by the inconsistencies in my story, by the nagging feeling that he missed something crucial? Perhaps one day, when the time is right, I'll pay him a visit. One last ride for old time's sake. After all, I have eternity to play with now, and the night is still young.